In the past, computation was expensive and slow. Originally, with the computers in the 1960s, to make interesting timbres and music, it usually took about 100 seconds to make 1 second of sound. Now, computers are incredibly more powerful than even the big computers were in the 60s. A modern laptop computer, which you can buy for a few $1,000s, or even less than $1,000, is at least 10,000 times more powerful and faster than the 7094, or even more than that, the 704, which started the music synthesis and sound processing programs. This means that a laptop computer could literally make a symphonic orchestra of separate instruments in real time. We divide the 10,000 by 100 to get the complexity figure and still work in real time, and you still have 100 left over of multiplication. So basically what this says is that the computer power which is available to musicians it now far exceeds what they know how to use effectively. The bottleneck is no longer in the computer. What do I feel is the limitations to what kind of music we can produce digitally, and what are the things that we need to study in the future? What are the directions that we should develop digital music? And I think the limitations are our basic understanding of what the human ear and the higher auditory sensors in the brain recognize as beautiful, inspiring music. So I think the question which is going to dominate the future is now understanding what kind of sounds we want to produce, rather than the means of usefully generating these sounds musically. This is going to revolve around both experimental psychological studies of how the brain and the ear react to sounds. But these kind of studies have been going on for many decades without producing appreciable music, and the reason is that they were being done by psychologists rather than composers and musicians. My feeling is that it's much easier for a composer who has whatever a mystery a composer has, a musical ear, a desire to make music, something that he wants to say musically, something he wants to communicate musically. I think it's much easier to teach a composer the techniques of modern psychology so that he can study the musical effects in the human brain than it is to teach a psychologist how to be a composer and make him want to be a composer. So that I think the next era will add to the burden of the, let's say, what the composer needs to make music. We've already added the necessity of dealing with computers to his burden, but now we need to add the kinds of experimental techniques that psychologists have developed to understand the reaction of the human brain to various, not only timbres, but sound sequences and harmonies and chords and other things that composers have always dealt with in an intuitive way, but now they need to deal with in a way which will relate to physical sound waves. So I think this will be a very long and gradual study and improvement, but a very interesting one, so that it will always be exciting. And I think there are new scientific tools that are already making results that are yielding results that are exciting. One of these tools is the NMR brain scanning techniques, which are a very crude tool compared to the complexity of the brain, but they do show what parts of the brain are activated by various stimuli. There's a very interesting book that a friend and associate, Dan Levitin, has recently published, entitled "This is Your Brain on Music," in which he looks at these questions of how the human, as much as is known today about how the human brain responds to music. He and a medical doctor did a study of how the brain responds to listening to a Beethoven symphony, and showed that well, there was a sequence of areas in the brain which were activated by listening to the music, the lower level auditory centers, and eventually the auditory cortex, and then the so-called pleasure center became active. They also showed that it was a high-level activation, and that it was not simply responding to the timbres of the sounds, because if one took the same music and chopped it up into short sections and scrambled the order of the sections so that the sequential effects, the short-term sequential effects were destroyed, but the timbres were basically retained, that the activation of the pleasure center, well, the activation of the other centers did increase, but the pleasure center was not activated. I recently went to a rock concert. I don't go to very many, and I was really amazed at the continuous and loud and driving rhythm that was in this concert, and at how much this the audience apparently enjoyed hearing this rhythm for an hour and moving to the rhythm. Even though they were sitting in chairs, they would stand up. So I wonder myself how rhythms stimulate the pleasure center, but I'd be willing to bet they do. Anyway, I've also, well, that's one reaction. Another reaction, though, is that lately random noises where you can control the spectra of the noise and you can put attacking decays on it, things like that, have gotten to be, in my opinion, too popular in computer music. And I guess for me they produce a negative stimulation of my pleasure center. And I wonder why this driving rhythm people like, and why I believe the random noise-like signals they dislike. So, as I say, I think the future lies in understanding the reaction of the human brain to music, and that will be a great area coming up.
What would you consider, let's say, the 3 most important innovations, contributions in computer music, and why?
My music programs 3 through 5, as far as computer science goes, were what were called block diagram compilers, where in this case the block diagrams were the unit generators. I think that is probably the most important innovation that I had a hand in. Music 5 block diagram, where the musician can assemble these blocks into the instrument he wants, came just a little bit before Moog and Buchla and some others made their voltage-controlled, patchable analog synthesizer boxes. But the digital and the analog things were developed within a few years of each other. So there was a zeitgeist of the times, really. So that's one thing. I think another very popular and very important contribution here was by Miller Puckett, and later in association with Dave Ziccarelli. And this was a graphic interface for block diagram compilers, so you could actually draw them on a computer display. And I think this has proven to be very, very amenable and pleasant and desired for most musicians as a way to make their instruments. I didn't have graphical interfaces of that kind when I started, so I've sort of learned myself always to just use written statements to interconnect my blocks, and I'm very comfortable with that. And I haven't jumped into Miller's program, Max MSP, but I highly respect it and think that it's a very, very popular program. And of course, the Risset's understanding of timbres and Chowning's efficient ways of synthesizing timbres, all related to modulations of spectra, is probably the third area that I think is the most important. Then I guess another area is sampled systems, where one records digital files, samples of traditional instruments or sounds from nature, or vocal samples, and then processes these samples in the computer program. And that would be another area that I think will